The court understands this is difficult, but you must tell us what happened that night.
What if the safest room in society, the courtroom, was actually the place where the most unsettling truths finally rise to the surface? What if behind every calm legal face sits a storm of secrets, quiet resentments, and hidden motives that no one sees until it's far too late? These are the questions the top lawyer in our story forces us to ask, not because he wants to scare us, but because he's seen something most people never do. The moment when a case stops being just a case and becomes a mirror to the darkest corners of human nature. He had handled robberies, fraud, violent offenders, even organized crime, yet nothing prepared him for the confrontation inside a San Diego courtroom. A confrontation involving a child whose actions were so meticulously planned, so quietly executed, and so emotionally hollow that even seasoned legal professionals struggled to breathe as the truth unfolded. It's easy to imagine danger coming from strangers, from shadows, from stories whispered on news channels. But what happens when danger grows inside a family? When the threat doesn't come from outside, but from the quietest seat at the dinner table? When the courtroom's biggest shock isn't a witness, a revelation, or a piece of evidence, but the simple, chilling realization that a child understood destruction better than she understood love. That is where this story begins, not with flashing lights, not with sirens, not with panic, but with a question no one in Delmare Heights could ever imagine asking. How does a peaceful family in a wealthy coastal neighborhood become the center of the most disturbing case in California's recent history? And more importantly, what truth was powerful enough to force a top lawyer to break decades of silence and finally speak? Because he didn't come forward to talk about procedure. He came forward to talk about something far more unsettling, something that changed his understanding of innocence forever. But before the world saw the courtroom explode with shock, the story had already started, quietly, inside a neighborhood that believed tragedy could never reach them. Delmare Heights was the kind of place people pointed to when they dreamed of a peaceful life, a coastal neighborhood wrapped in ocean breezes, eucalyptus trees, and the quiet confidence that danger only existed on television. Parents jogged before sunrise, children biked to school without fear, and neighbors waved from manicured driveways as if nothing dark could ever slip between them. It was the kind of place where people double-locked their doors out of habit, not necessity, because deep down they believed those locks were symbolic rather than needed. But illusions are fragile, and Delmare Heights was about to learn just how thin their protective bubble really was. Behind the calm porches and golden sunsets lay a truth no community wants to admit. Evil doesn't always enter your life violently, it can grow quietly inside it. The families of Delmare Heights were proud of their routines, their safety, their sense of control, and they never noticed the one household where something was shifting, something subtle yet unmistakably wrong. To outsiders, the Hermer home looked picture-perfect: 3 daughters, a hardworking father, a devoted mother, school events, beach trips, and smiles captured in dozens of photographs. But photographs freeze smiles, not feelings. They hide tension, they hide resentment. And in this home, resentment was beginning to take shape in the shadows of a child who felt invisible. While neighbors admired how polite and well-behaved the sisters were, they never saw the one pair of eyes that watched everything quietly, absorbing every compliment given to the younger girls like a wound, reopening each time. The storm inside that house didn't break suddenly. It formed slowly, silently, gathering strength, while the world remained convinced that Delmare Heights was as safe and predictable as the tides that touched its shore. The top lawyer would later say that this case taught him something he never forgot. Danger doesn't always knock. Sometimes it grows behind a closed door, brushing its teeth at the same sink, eating breakfast at the same table. And by the time anyone realizes it, it's already too late. Because the illusion of safety finally shattered the day, the Hermer sisters stepped into the woods, believing they were simply going to build a secret fort, unaware they were walking into a carefully crafted plan. In a family photo, you would never notice anything wrong. The Hermer sisters, Leslie, Nicole, and Jessica, stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling with the brightness that only childhood can produce. Leslie, the energetic middle child, carried the confidence of someone who excelled effortlessly at everything she touched. Nicole, the youngest, had a gentleness in her eyes that made people soften when they spoke to her, a child who felt the world deeply, painted it beautifully, and cared for it quietly. And then there was Jessica, the oldest, the quiet one, the one whose smile in photos always seemed slightly delayed, slightly forced, slightly distant. To neighbors, they were a trio of well-behaved girls from a loving home. To teachers, they were gifted children with promising futures. But inside the walls of that home, something else was growing, something invisible but powerful. While Leslie collected medals and applause, and Nicole collected affection like a magnet draws light, Jessica collected silence. She wasn't ignored, not intentionally. but comparison is a dangerous blade, especially when held against a child who already feels like she's standing behind everyone else. The younger girls filled rooms with laughter and stories. Jessica filled notebooks with feelings she didn't know how to express: frustration, jealousy, loneliness, the sense that she was fading into the background of her own family. Jealousy in children usually comes and goes. But in Jessica, it didn't come and go. It stayed, it settled, it thickened, slowly, quietly, like sediment at the bottom of a river, building layer after layer until the water above begins to change course. And the adults around her, loving, caring, doing their best, never saw the shift happening. They never saw the resentment taking shape like a shadow stretching across the room. They saw 3 daughters, 3 smiles, 3 futures. They didn't see the internal storm forming inside the oldest one, the storm that didn't rage loudly, but brewed silently with frightening calculation. The kind of storm that doesn't burst, it waits. And that storm finally found its moment the day the sisters walked into the woods, believing they were going to build something innocent, never realizing one of them had come to destroy everything instead. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, the kind parents don't think twice about. The sun sat soft over Delmere Heights, the air carrying that familiar blend of ocean salt and eucalyptus, and 3 sisters stepped out of their house with backpacks bouncing lightly against their shoulders. Nicole and Leslie were excited, genuinely, innocently excited, because in their minds, they were heading out to build a secret fort in the park's wooded extension, a little world of branches and imagination far away from homework and rules. To them, it was play. To Jessica, it was preparation. Everything she needed had been arranged long before that afternoon, every detail organized, every step rehearsed. It wasn't impulsive, it was calculated with a chilling, quiet patience. She led her younger sisters deeper into the reserve than they had ever gone before, guiding them off the familiar trail with the ease of someone who had studied this path repeatedly, memorizing turns and clearings the way some kids memorize lyrics from their favorite songs. Nicole giggled at the sound of rustling leaves. Leslie pointed out shapes in the trees. Neither noticed how focused Jessica was. Neither noticed her glancing at the sky, the trail behind them, the time. Kids usually stumble into danger accidentally, but that day only 2 of them stumbled. One of them steered. The deeper they walked, the more the world around them changed. Less sunlight, more shadow. Fewer joggers, more silence. But the younger girls trusted their sister. They followed her without hesitation, without question, without imagining that the person walking ahead of them wasn't searching for the right spot to build something, but the right spot to end something. And this is where innocence becomes its own tragic weapon, not because children choose the wrong people to trust, but because they never imagined betrayal could come from someone who shares their last name. And when the sisters reached the clearing Jessica had chosen, the illusion finally shattered, because what happened next would haunt the entire community forever. The clearing didn't look like a place where horror belonged. Sunlight slipped through the branches in soft, broken beams, the soil was cool and undisturbed, and the air carried nothing but the gentle scent of coastal trees. To Nicole and Leslie, it must have seemed perfect, the ideal spot to build the secret fort they'd been planning with childish excitement. They dropped their backpacks, laughing about who would collect the biggest branches, already imagining fairy lights, hideouts, and whispered secrets. They had no idea Jessica had chosen this very place weeks earlier. No idea she had studied maps of the park, searched for the quietest point, the deepest turn, the spot where sound would muffle and footsteps wouldn't echo. Nicole wandered toward a patch of leaves. Leslie knelt to examine a fallen branch. And Jessica watched them with a stillness no child should ever possess. Somewhere in her mind, a decision had already been made long before their feet touched the clearing. She wasn't building anything today. She was finishing something. While the younger girls' backs were turned, completely unprotected, completely trusting, Jessica reached into her father's duffel bag, the bag they thought held snacks or tools for their fort. But instead, she pulled out the weight she had rehearsed holding, the mechanism she had studied in secret, the weapon she believed would change her life by erasing theirs. No screams were heard, no warnings. Just the faint sound of something mechanical, followed by a moment that shattered the fragile innocence of 2 children forever. In that patch of quiet forest, childhood ended, not just for the victims, but for the entire community that would soon learn what happened there. The clearing that should have held laughter became a silent witness to the darkest truth imaginable. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the person walking closest to you. And when the bodies were discovered the next morning, it wasn't just the horror of the crime that stunned investigators. It was the weapon left behind, hidden poorly, as if the killer wanted someone to find it, but not too quickly. When the sun rose the next morning, The forest seemed unchanged to anyone passing by, quiet, peaceful, unaware. But hidden beneath a thin cover of leaves and broken branches lay a truth so disturbing that even veteran investigators struggled to process it. A morning jogger spotted what she first thought was discarded clothing. She stepped closer, hesitated, and then the world she knew shattered. Within minutes, police sealed off the ravine, their radios crackling with disbelief as they confirmed the unimaginable. Two children, deliberately hidden but not well enough to stay concealed, and just a short distance from their bodies, tucked into the shadows as if someone wanted it discovered only after a delay, rested a canvas duffel bag. At first glance, it looked like something an outdoorsman might have forgotten, ordinary, harmless. But when investigators unzipped it, the tone of the entire crime scene shifted. Inside lay a rifle. Not a toy, not an old heirloom, but a Remington bolt-action weapon kept locked inside the Hermer home, secured, protected, and absolutely out of reach for any child, or so everyone believed. The father had stored it in a dedicated safe, confident that only he and his wife had access. But investigators quickly realized there was no sign of forced entry, no broken lock, no damaged hinge. Whoever took that weapon didn't break into the safe. They opened it. They understood how it worked. They knew exactly what they were doing. Even more unsettling was how the gun had been left behind, not tossed carelessly, not buried deep, but placed just far enough away to buy the killer time. It was almost as if the shooter wanted the weapon found eventually, but not before they could return home and pretend nothing had ever happened. The weapon told a story long before any suspect spoke a word. This was not a spontaneous act of rage. This was preparation, planning, intent, and every clue investigators uncovered pushed them toward a chilling realization. Because when detectives returned to the Hermer home to deliver the news, one person inside reacted in a way no grieving child ever should, and that reaction changed the direction of the entire investigation. When detectives arrived at the Hermer home to deliver the devastating news, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The parents collapsed into a grief so raw it tore through the room, a mother trembling with disbelief, a father sinking to his knees as if the floor had vanished beneath him. Their cries filled the house, echoing the heartbreak of a family destroyed in a single evening. But in the midst of that emotional explosion sat one figure who didn't move, Jessica, the only surviving daughter. The child who had supposedly left her sisters at the park just hours before they vanished. She didn't cry, she didn't panic, she didn't ask questions, she didn't even stand up. Instead, she sat perfectly still on the living room sofa, watching the devastation unfold, as if she were a silent observer rather than someone connected by blood to the victims. One detective later described the moment as unnerving, like watching someone who hadn't yet decided what emotion they were supposed to copy. When they mentioned the rifle found near the bodies, her father rushed to check the gun safe and returned pale and shaking, whispering, "It was locked, it was locked." But Jessica. She blinked once, just once, and detectives noticed, because children don't hide shock well. Kids break down, they cling to parents, they ask if their siblings are really gone, they don't sit calmly with steady breathing and blank eyes. One officer recorded later in her report, she showed less reaction than officers who had never met the victims. And when detectives gently asked Jessica to retell what happened at the park, her answers were cold, clipped, and strangely rehearsed. She couldn't explain why she left them, couldn't explain where exactly, couldn't explain the timeline, and her voice held no tremor, no confusion, no grief. Something was wrong, very wrong, and investigators felt it instantly. But they wouldn't understand just how wrong things were until they opened the family computer and discovered a trail of searches no ordinary child could ever explain. The shift in the investigation came not from a confession, not from a witness, and not from a slip of the tongue, but from a glowing computer screen in the Hermer home office. A device shared by the whole family, innocent on the surface, holding nothing more suspicious than homework files, family photos, and school calendars. But digital footprints never lie. And the moment the forensic technician opened the browser history, the entire case tilted in a direction no one wanted to believe. At first, the searches looked harmless. Simple questions, basic curiosity. Then the tone changed sharply, disturbingly, unmistakably. Someone had searched how to operate a Remington bolt-action rifle, the exact model found beside the bodies. Someone had looked up recoil control for small shooters. Someone had researched how far gunshots travel in wooded areas. Someone had searched, can a kid fire a rifle accurately? And then the searches turned darker. How to make gunshots quieter, how to avoid leaving fingerprints, how to hide someone in the woods. And the most chilling of all, will people think it's an accident if a kid shoots someone? These were not searches made out of momentary anger or childish curiosity. They followed a pattern, a methodical step-by-step progression from understanding the weapon, to controlling the weapon, to using the weapon. The timestamps told another story. Every search took place when Nicole and Leslie were at their after-school activities, and Jessica was home alone. There were no signs of hacking, no remote access, no other explanation. This wasn't random browsing, it was a blueprint. A digital diary of preparation. And when investigators compared the dates of the searches to the day of the murders, they discovered something even more unsettling. Jessica had searched how to open a locked gun safe just 3 days before her sisters died. The computer didn't reveal a motive, but it revealed intent, calculated, deliberate, patient intent. But technology was only the beginning, because once investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the truth no one wanted to confront. Jessica hadn't just planned how to kill, she had planned who she wanted to become when it was over. The deeper investigators dug into Jessica's digital behavior, the more disturbing the pattern became, not just because she had researched how to kill, but because she had also researched what life might look like after her sisters were gone. Hidden between weapon tutorials and park maps were searches no one expected from a 12-year-old. What happens to the oldest child when siblings die? Do parents love only child more? How long before people stop asking questions? These weren't the questions of someone panicking, confused, or lashing out. They were the questions of someone imagining a future in which she stood alone, centered, noticed, finally important. Investigators began to see the shape of something far more complex than simple jealousy. This wasn't about a single moment of anger. This was about identity. In her school assignments, rewritten in quiet handwriting, she described characters who felt invisible, characters who dreamed of becoming the only one who mattered. In her private notebook, she wrote phrases like, "Everyone sees them, no one sees me, and if they were gone, I could finally breathe." For most children, jealousy fades. For Jessica, it hardened into something sharp, something she carried with her like a secret weapon long before she ever touched a rifle. She had started to separate herself emotionally from her sisters, imagining a world where she didn't have to share attention, affection, or space. A world where she wasn't the background character in her own home. A world where she could finally be the center. And the most unsettling part, Jessica hadn't just planned the crime, she had planned the after. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would act, how she would pretend to be the grieving sister who returned home because she got bored while her younger siblings stayed behind. She planned the persona of the survivor, the victim. The only child left behind, the role she wanted so desperately that she was willing to destroy everything to claim it. When investigators realized this, the case stopped feeling like a tragedy driven by emotion and started feeling like a tragedy driven by calculation. But the most revealing clues weren't found in notebooks or search bars. They were hidden inside the small cracks of family life, cracks that had been widening long before anyone knew where they would lead. From the outside, the Hermer family looked balanced. 3 daughters, 2 careers, weekend outings, school events, and refrigerator doors filled with artwork and certificates. But to investigators, the real story lived in the unspoken patterns of the household, the tiny emotional shifts that build slowly over time until they become something no one can ignore. Nicole and Leslie were naturally expressive children, easy to praise, easy to love openly, the kind who filled rooms with color and conversation. Nicole brought home paintings that teachers cherished. Leslie brought home medals that made neighbors applaud. Their achievements sparkled, drawing attention the way sunlight draws the eye. Jessica, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved. A child who didn't announce herself, didn't demand recognition, didn't shine in ways that drew applause. Her accomplishments were subtle, consistent grades, independent projects, a mind that worked inwardly rather than outwardly. But subtle often gets overlooked in families bustling with activity. When her parents praised the younger girls, it wasn't favoritism, not intentionally. It was simply human nature. People react to what they can see, hear, and feel most vividly. Yet in Jessica's world, that wasn't just oversight. It was confirmation of her deepest fear that she was forgettable, invisible, unwanted. Small things fueled this narrative. A missed science fair because of a swim meet, a forgotten art assignment in a folder while Nicole's painting got hung on the wall, a compliment meant for encouragement that Jessica interpreted as comparison. These weren't acts of neglect, they were accidents of busy life. But to a child already sliding into emotional isolation, they became proof of everything she believed was wrong. Teachers remembered moments too, Jessica snapping at a classmate for praising Leslie's sports performance, or quietly tearing apart her own work after Nicole was chosen for a school feature. None of these moments alone signaled danger. But together, they formed a pattern. A child who felt overshadowed, unheard, and increasingly disconnected from a family that loved her without realizing she couldn't feel it. And while Nicole and Leslie saw their home as a place of joy, Jessica saw it as a place where she was slowly disappearing. But the people who saw the earliest warning signs weren't inside the family at all. They were the ones who spent quiet afternoons with the sisters, observing moments the parents never witnessed. Sometimes the most revealing truths come not from parents or teachers, but from the people who spend those ordinary, quiet hours with a family, the ones who witness unfiltered moments. For the Hermer sisters, that person was their former babysitter, Olivia. She had been in their home long before the tragedy, long before investigators began piecing together the emotional landscape that shaped Jessica's mind. And when detectives spoke with her, Olivia described moments so small they almost didn't sound alarming until she explained how they connected. She recalled how Nicole would proudly show her drawings, how Leslie would demonstrate a new dance routine, and how Jessica would quietly walk away mid-performance, slipping into another room without a word. She remembered how Jessica would roll her eyes when the younger girls were praised, how she sometimes muttered under her breath, "Of course they're perfect." But the moments that made Olivia pause, moments she once brushed off as normal sibling jealousy, now carried a deeper, darker weight. Like the time Nicole's watercolor was taped to the fridge, and later that evening, Olivia found it torn into strips inside the kitchen trash. No explanation, no tantrum, just silent destruction. Or when Leslie won a small trophy for swimming, only for Olivia to find it mysteriously snapped in half days later, tucked behind the sofa, as if someone wanted it broken but not discovered. And then there was the afternoon Olivia walked into Jessica's room and found her cutting up family photos, not angrily, not emotionally, but with eerie calm, trimming out Nicole and Leslie from every image. When asked why, Jessica simply said, "They ruin everything," in a voice flat enough to make Olivia freeze. Back then, Olivia dismissed it as childhood frustration. Kids get jealous after all, they act out. But now, hearing about the crime, she felt sick with the realization these weren't outbursts. They were patterns, warnings, early seeds of a mindset that didn't see sisters as loved companions, but as obstacles blocking the life Jessica believed she deserved. And investigators soon discovered something even more unnerving. Jessica had been documenting her thoughts long before the murders, in a private journal filled with words no one expected from a 12-year-old. When investigators opened Jessica's journal, they weren't searching for a confession. They were searching for context, something to explain the subtle hostility others had witnessed. But what they found wasn't subtle at all. Her handwriting was neat, almost delicate, each letter shaped with a calmness that felt unsettling when paired with her words. At first, the entries read like those of any withdrawn child. Short complaints about school, notes about feeling left out, quiet wishes for more attention. But as detectives turned the pages, those thoughts darkened, shifted, deepened. Instead of childish frustration, they found statements that felt eerily calculated. They take up all the space. If they weren't here, Mom and Dad would finally notice me. I could be special if they weren't always in the way. Jealousy is normal. Children write dramatic things, they vent, they exaggerate. But Jessica's writing wasn't impulsive or emotional, it was controlled, cold, revisited over and over. Her fantasies didn't fade with time, they sharpened. The journal revealed that she didn't just resent Nicole and Leslie, she resented the way the world seemed to celebrate them. Their art, their sports, their personalities. She wrote about feeling invisible, about wishing the house felt quieter, emptier, like she imagined it would if she were the only child. And then there was the entry investigators could never erase from their minds. "One day, it will just be me. I'll finally matter." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plan. It was a belief, a vision of a future where her value increased only through the absence of others. The journal didn't detail how she would act on that belief, but it made one thing painfully clear. Jessica had been emotionally separating from her sisters long before she physically led them into the woods. The seeds of violence weren't planted the day of the crime. They were nurtured slowly, quietly, in the corners of a young mind that convinced itself salvation required eliminating competition. But to understand how those thoughts transformed into action, investigators needed more than journal entries. They needed a psychological explanation, something that revealed the depth of what was happening inside Jessica's mind. When psychologists were brought into the investigation, they weren't expecting a simple answer. Children act out of impulse, emotion, confusion, but what Jessica did didn't resemble impulse. It resembled strategy, calculation, intent. And that demanded a deeper look into the mind behind the action. The lead forensic psychologist described Jessica's behavior with a term rarely applied to someone her age: pathological jealousy, not ordinary sibling rivalry. Not the temporary resentment children feel when attention shifts. This was a chronic, internalized belief that she was being erased by the presence of her younger sisters. A belief that had grown roots and branched into every corner of her thinking. Most children compete with siblings, but they don't rewrite the entire narrative of their life around the idea that everything would be better if the others disappeared. Jessica did. She interpreted small moments, forgotten praise, missed events, casual compliments, as evidence of a conspiracy against her. In her mind, Nicole and Leslie weren't siblings anymore. They were obstacles, living reminders of everything she thought she couldn't be. And because she felt emotionally detached, she couldn't perceive them the way healthy children do. Instead of viewing her sisters as individuals with their own joys, fears, and needs, she viewed them as symbols of everything that overshadowed her. Psychologists noted something else disturbing. Jessica didn't process consequences the way most children do. Children fear punishment. They fear disappointing parents. They fear harm. Jessica showed none of those fears. Her digital searches proved she understood legal consequences, but the emotional weight of those consequences meant nothing to her. She wasn't afraid of guilt, because guilt was something she didn't fully experience. She wasn't afraid of loss, because she saw herself as the one being lost. Her journals, her behaviors, her reactions at home, they all pointed to one terrifying truth. Jessica believed removing her sisters wasn't an act of destruction, it was an act of correction. A way to balance a world she felt had tilted against her since the day they were born. But even with this chilling psychological profile, investigators still needed something concrete, something undeniable, and they found it when Jessica sat down in the interrogation room for the first time. When Jessica was brought into the juvenile interrogation room, detectives didn't expect a confession. They expected tears, confusion, maybe anger, something human. Instead, they were met with a child who entered the room like a student walking into a routine exam, calm, composed, almost bored. The room had been softened on purpose, warm lighting, cushioned chairs, a child psychologist nearby, everything designed to make a 12-year-old feel safe enough to speak. But Jessica didn't need warmth or reassurance. She needed control. Detectives asked her to recount the afternoon in the park, and she delivered the story with mechanical precision. How her sisters wanted to play longer, how she supposedly got bored and walked home. No hesitation. No emotion, no detail that made the story believable, but no crack big enough to break it either. It was rehearsed, memorized, and that alone put investigators on edge. Children guessing their way through a lie usually crumble when questions shift unexpectedly. But Jessica didn't. She simply repeated her script, word for word, like someone pressing play on a pre-recorded message. Then detectives shifted strategies. They slid photographs across the table, not graphic but real, images of the clearing, the duffel bag, the weapon. Jessica didn't flinch. They mentioned the timeline, the missing rifle. The strange details in her story, still no change. But when they casually mentioned that the computer in her home had been examined, something flickered across her face just for a moment. A tightening of the jaw, a sharper breath. A microsecond of panic trying to hide behind control. That was the first crack, and detectives knew it. They didn't press yet. They let the silence fill the room, stretching thin like a wire pulled too tight. Jessica tried to maintain her mask, but underneath it, investigators sensed something shifting. A child clinging to a lie she once felt confident in, now realizing the walls around her were beginning to close in. But the real turning point came not from Jessica's face or her words. It came from the moment detectives placed undeniable evidence in front of her, and the carefully prepared story she carried began to collapse piece by piece. Detectives knew the moment had come. They had let Jessica tell her polished story, let her recite it with the emotionless calm of someone who believed preparation could outsmart truth. But now it was time to introduce something she couldn't rehearse her way around. Slowly, deliberately, they opened a folder thick with documents and placed the first sheet in front of her. A printed screenshot of the computer search on how to load a Remington bolt-action rifle. Jessica blinked, but her expression stayed unnervingly steady. The detective slid the next sheet forward, how to make gunshots quieter in wooded areas. Then another, how far sound travels in ravines. And then the one that made the room feel colder. Will people think accident if kid shoots someone? Jessica looked at it, really looked at it. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. Detectives watched the shift happen, not a break, not yet, but the beginning of one. For the first time, she wasn't reciting answers. She was choosing them, and choosing took effort. The detective asked gently, "Jessica, can you explain these?" Her jaw set. Anyone could have searched that. A predictable line. But detectives weren't dealing with guesses. They already had the timestamps. They knew her sisters were at dance and soccer during those hours. They knew her parents were at work. And they knew the computer automatically logged into her father's profile every afternoon, exactly when Jessica was home alone. When they showed her the timeline, searches evolving from curiosity to skill to intent, the silence in the room changed. It wasn't calm anymore. It was heavy, pressurized. And then came the most damning piece. Gunshot residue found on Jessica's jacket, the same one she'd worn that day. When the photo of the test results slid across the table, she looked away, not in sorrow, not in fear, but in irritation, like someone who realizes a detail she overlooked is now catching up to her. That reaction told detectives everything they needed to know, but the real unraveling didn't happen with evidence. It happened when they asked one simple question, a question no 12-year-old should ever answer the way Jessica did, and it changed the course of the entire case. Detectives knew that evidence could corner a suspect, but only the right question could reveal the truth behind the crime. And with Jessica, they needed a question she wasn't prepared for, something that pierced through the mask she had rehearsed so carefully. So after laying out the timeline, the searches, the residue, the inconsistencies, the detective leaned forward and softened his voice, removing all pressure as if speaking to a frightened child. "Jessica," he asked, "can you help us understand why you left your sisters alone in the woods?" It was intentionally gentle, not accusatory, not sharp, a question meant to open a window rather than force a door. Jessica didn't answer right away. For the first time, her silence wasn't control, it was calculation. She wasn't searching for truth, she was searching for the correct lie. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its smooth, practiced tone. "They were being annoying, I just wanted to go home." But annoyance doesn't explain preparation. Annoyance doesn't explain stolen keys, studied maps, or rehearsed alibis. Detectives let her answer hang in the air, then followed with the real question, the one designed to reveal motive, not mechanics. "Jessica, what did you think would happen to Nicole and Leslie after you left?" It was the first moment she looked truly caught. Her expression didn't twist with guilt, it didn't soften with remorse. Instead, the blankness returned, but sharper now, like a curtain being pulled shut. The psychologist in the room watched her posture shift, watched her eyes narrow, watched her breathing change. And then came the words that chilled everyone present. "If they weren't there, I wouldn't have to share anymore." Not shouted, not cried, spoken in the steady tone of someone stating a fact. Someone who believed they were explaining, rather than confessing. Someone who didn't yet understand that this simple sentence had just revealed the entire truth detectives were searching for. From that moment on, the investigation was no longer about how the crime happened. It was about why a child believed her sisters had to disappear for her life to finally begin. And once that chilling motive was exposed, detectives had no choice but to move to the next unthinkable step, arresting a 12-year-old for one of the most calculated crimes the city had ever seen. Once detectives heard Jessica's chilling explanation, spoken without hesitation, remorse, or even the faintest tremor, they knew the investigation had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a child lost in an emotional moment. This was intent. And intent meant only one thing. They had to arrest a 12-year-old for a crime more calculated than many adult homicides. The logistics alone were agonizing. How do you approach parents who have just lost two daughters, only to tell them their remaining child is responsible? How do you handcuff someone still small enough to sit at the kid's table? How do you reconcile a face that still has baby softness with actions that belong to a hardened mind? But law isn't shaped by age, it's shaped by evidence, and evidence didn't lie. On the morning officers arrived to take Jessica into custody, the neighborhood slowed to a stunned hush. Patrol cars moved quietly down the Palm-lined street, not with sirens, but with restraint, as though even the vehicles understood the weight of what was happening. Inside the relative's home where the Hermers were staying, her parents were told privately what investigators now knew. The sound that followed, a mother's gasp collapsing into a sob, would stay with officers for the rest of their careers. Michael Hermer, barely standing, looked at his eldest daughter as though he were seeing a stranger wearing his child's face. Jessica, meanwhile, didn't cry, didn't protest, didn't cling to anyone. She simply asked in a disturbingly flat tone, "Do I need to bring my jacket?" It was the kind of question a child might ask on her way to school, not on her way to a detention center for double murder. Officers didn't handcuff her. They couldn't justify placing chains on wrists that small unless absolutely necessary. But even without cuffs, the image was haunting. A quiet girl walking calmly between two officers while her parents fell apart behind her. And outside, neighbors watched from behind curtains, unable to comprehend that the girl they once saw riding her bike to the park was now the center of the most chilling arrest Delmare Heights had ever witnessed. But the arrest was only the beginning. The real battle, the one that would divide psychologists, lawyers, and the entire nation, began when prosecutors faced the impossible question: should a child this young be tried as an adult? Prosecutors knew this case wasn't just about what happened in the ravine. It was about what the justice system should do when the person behind a meticulously planned double murder is barely old enough to cross the street alone. The moment Jessica was brought into juvenile detention, a storm of questions erupted behind closed legal doors. Could she understand right from wrong, clearly? Could she anticipate consequences? Her internet searches proved she did. Could she plan, hide, deceive? She had done all three with alarming precision, but she was 12, and that single fact placed prosecutors in the center of one of the hardest decisions the juvenile justice system can face. Was this crime the result of a child's immaturity, or something far more dangerous and permanent? Assistant District Attorney Emma Baker described reviewing the case files late into the night, weighing the evidence against the law, the psychology, and the moral responsibility she carried. Every detail, the searches, the stolen key, the practiced opening of the gun safe, the chosen location, the concealed bodies, the calm return home, suggested not impulse but sophistication. More than some adult offenders she had prosecuted, yet the law wasn't written for children like Jessica, children who could mimic the mindset of an adult offender while still possessing the body and brain of someone in middle school. Psychologists were split. Some argued that no child, regardless of behavior, should face adult charges because their brains are still forming. Others pointed out Jessica's lack of remorse, her advanced planning, and her disturbing sense of entitlement as indications of deeper issues, issues unlikely to change with time alone. In the courtroom, these arguments collided. Defense attorneys insisted Jessica needed treatment, not punishment, that her emotional landscape was fractured, not malicious, that impulsive jealousy drove her, not true criminal intent. But prosecutors countered with chilling clarity. Impulsive jealousy didn't explain a month-long plan. It didn't explain carefully researched methods. It didn't explain the cold confession. And in the end, the judge saw what the evidence made impossible to ignore. Jessica Hermer possessed enough understanding, calculation, and control to be held to the standards of an adult offender. The ruling was unprecedented, devastating. Controversial, Jessica, at just 12 years old, would be tried as an adult for double murder. And as the trial approached, the courtroom transformed into something no one expected, a stage where the calmest person in the room was the defendant herself. When Jessica entered the courtroom for the first time, the air shifted in a way even seasoned attorneys couldn't explain. People expected a trembling child, a fragile figure overwhelmed by the weight of what she'd done. Instead, they watched a small girl with neatly combed hair, a plain dress, and a face so emotionless it made the room feel colder. She didn't scan the crowd. She didn't look for her parents. She didn't cling to her attorneys. Jessica walked with the composed stillness of someone attending a routine school meeting, not a murder trial that had seized national attention. And that unsettling composure rattled everyone. Jurors glanced at her with disbelief. Whispers floated across the gallery, and even the judge paused longer than usual before beginning proceedings, as if recalibrating her expectations. The prosecution table was stacked with binders, photographs, ballistic reports, digital forensics, psychological evaluations, more evidence than some homicide trials involving adults twice her age. But Jessica sat without shifting, without fidgeting, without any sign she recognized the gravity of the moment. Reporters described her presence in the same way, quiet, cold, neutral, eerily calm. What unnerved people most wasn't that she lacked emotion, it was that she seemed comfortable in the silence surrounding her. When prosecutors played home videos of her sisters, laughing, painting, dancing, running through sprinklers, many in the courtroom wiped away tears. Even the jury looked visibly shaken. Jessica, however, didn't blink more than usual. She didn't look down, she didn't look away. She just watched. That emotional disconnect didn't go unnoticed. A top lawyer observing the case later said, "It was the first time in my career that the quietest person in the courtroom carried the most psychological weight. Every time a witness spoke about Nicole's kindness, or Leslie's vibrant energy, or the way the community grieved their loss, you could feel a heaviness spreading across the room. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared anyone for how Jessica's demeanor would influence the expert testimonies that followed, because the calmness she displayed wasn't neutrality, it was a clue. In the moment the psychological experts took the stand, that clue transformed into something far more unsettling, a portrait of a mind that understood the crime far better than a child ever should. When the psychological experts took the stand, the courtroom shifted from emotional testimony to something far heavier, clinical truth. These weren't people who spoke in guesses or feelings. They spoke in patterns, behaviors, and documented signs. And when they spoke about Jessica, the room leaned in, because everyone knew this case didn't make sense through the lens of ordinary childhood. The first forensic psychologist explained that typical children who commit violent acts act impulsively, during fights, emotional outbursts, moments of lost control. But Jessica's act was not impulsive. It was prepared, layered. Structured, she didn't stumble into violence, she built toward it. The expert described her mindset using terms that made the courtroom fall silent: emotional detachment, pathological resentment, goal-oriented aggression. She wasn't driven by sudden anger. She wasn't overwhelmed by rage. She was executing a solution she believed would fix her life. Another psychologist reviewed her interview footage with detectives, pointing out small details most people missed. Her steady breathing during the interrogation, her lack of remorse, her careful eye contact, the absence of panic even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. These weren't signs of a confused child. They were signs of someone who understood control, someone who recognized emotional displays as optional, not automatic. The expert explained that Jessica's emotional development had diverged from her peers. While most children rely heavily on attachment, empathy, and social bonds, Jessica operated on a different psychological grid, one where relationships were weighed not by affection, but by advantage. Nicole and Leslie were not perceived as siblings in her internal world. They were variables, obstacles, symbols of everything she believed she lacked. When asked whether Jessica understood the permanence of death, the psychologist didn't hesitate. She understood enough to plan for the aftermath. She understood enough to imagine the life she wanted once her sisters were gone. The words landed like a blow, because this wasn't the psychology of a spontaneous act, it was the psychology of intention. Pure, chilling intention. And if the experts unsettled the courtroom, what happened next shook it to its core, because the one person no one expected to speak took the stand: Jessica herself. When Jessica chose to testify, the courtroom froze. Children rarely take the stand in cases this severe. Defense attorneys avoid it unless absolutely necessary. Prosecutors expect fear, tears, confusion. But Jessica walked to the witness chair with the same controlled stillness she carried into the interrogation room. No trembling hands, no darting eyes, no visible fear. She sat, placed her small hands neatly in her lap, and looked at the judge with unsettling calm, as though she were about to answer questions on a school assignment rather than a double murder. The defense began gently, asking her to describe her family life. Jessica spoke in a monotone voice, describing her sisters not with affection or grief, but with practicality, mentioning schedules, routines, chores. When asked how she felt about them, her answer was chillingly simple: they got everything. She didn't elaborate. She didn't consider how it sounded. It wasn't anger, it was observation. Then the defense moved to the day of the murders. Jessica repeated her original story with the same rehearsed cadence she had used in interrogation, but something was different now. The entire courtroom could see the contrast between her calm demeanor and the horror of what had happened. It was as if she understood the script, but not the meaning of the play she was in. Then came the cross-examination, the moment the prosecution had meticulously prepared for. The prosecutor asked, "Jessica, when you led your sisters into the woods, what did you think would happen to them?" Jessica paused, not in fear, but in contemplation, and then she answered with the same eerie clarity she'd shown before. "I thought it would finally be quieter at home." Audible gasps rippled across the courtroom. The prosecutor pressed gently. "Did you understand they wouldn't come back?" Jessica nodded. That was the point. No tears, no remorse. No attempt to soften her words. Just a flat acceptance of responsibility, paired with an equally flat absence of regret. In that moment, the jury didn't see a confused child or a panicked adolescent. They saw someone who understood the consequences clearly and wanted them. And after hearing Jessica's own words, the courtroom braced for the final clash. Closing arguments where two entirely different versions of justice collided head-on. When closing arguments began, the courtroom felt heavier than it had at any point during the trial, not because the evidence changed, but because Jessica's own words were now echoing in every juror's mind. The prosecution and defense weren't just presenting arguments. They were presenting two entirely different interpretations of what justice meant when the killer was a child who never acted like one. Assistant District Attorney Emma Baker stood in front of the jury with a presence sharpened by experience, but even she carried a different weight today. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply walked them through the truth they had witnessed piece by piece. The months of planning, the calculated searches, the stolen key, the mapped-out route, the chosen clearing, the mechanical precision of the shots. And finally, Jessica's own testimony, delivered without a flicker of remorse. Baker said something that silenced even the defense table. This was not a child who lost control. This was a child who took control. She reminded the jury that intention, not age, defined murder in its purest legal form. Then she paused, lowered her voice, and delivered the line that would replay across news channels for months. Being 12 explains her size. It does not explain her choices. When Baker sat down, even the judge appeared shaken. Then the defense rose. Their strategy was the opposite, soft, emotional, pleading the humanity that Jessica herself never displayed. They painted a portrait of a damaged girl, neglected emotionally, overshadowed, drowning in comparison. A child whose brain was still under construction, whose jealousy mutated into something she didn't have the maturity to control or fully understand. Her attorney spoke of treatment, rehabilitation, second chances, reminding the court that the law must be fair not only to victims, but also to offenders who are still fundamentally children. She is 12, the defense repeated. 12, the word lingered in the air, trembling with the desperation of someone begging the jury to see innocence where innocence no longer existed. When both sides finished, the jury wasn't just deciding guilt. They were deciding how society would define responsibility in one of the most disturbing cases they had ever encountered. And after hours of silence behind the deliberation room doors, the jury returned, faces pale, eyes heavy, ready to deliver a verdict that would stun the entire nation. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was so tense it felt like even the walls were holding their breath. Reporters leaned forward, attorneys stiffened. The judge lowered her gaze as if preparing herself. But the most striking figure in the room was Jessica, sitting perfectly still, legs tucked neatly, hands folded, eyes blank. No fear, no anticipation. Just a 12-year-old girl waiting for the outcome of a double murder trial as calmly as if she were waiting for a school bell to ring. The forewoman, a woman in her 50s with trembling hands, stood to deliver the verdict. She swallowed hard before speaking, knowing her voice would soon carry across headlines, legal journals, and living rooms across the country. On the charge of first-degree murder of Nicole Hermer, her voice cracked, we find the defendant, Jessica Hermer, guilty. A soft gasp moved through the courtroom like a cold breeze. Jessica didn't flinch. The forewoman continued, her voice growing more strained with each word. On the charge of first-degree murder of Leslie Hermer, guilty. On the special circumstance of multiple victims, true. On the special circumstance of lying in wait, true. Each word was like the drop of a hammer. The kind of verdict rarely delivered to someone barely over 4 feet tall. Behind Jessica, her parents collapsed into one another, torn between grief for the daughters they lost and grief for the daughter they were losing again in a different way. The courtroom didn't erupt, it didn't buzz with chatter. It fell into an eerie silence as everyone absorbed what they had witnessed. A child had been found guilty of the most serious crimes the legal system can charge, and she sat there unmoving. Unchanged, unshaken. Even as her fate was sealed, she didn't shed a tear, didn't reach for her attorney, didn't look at her parents. It was as if the verdict didn't apply to her. As if this was simply another expected step in the plan she had crafted long before the world knew her name. But the true shock was still ahead, because when the judge stood to deliver Jessica's sentence, she announced something so unprecedented, so extreme, that it ignited a national outrage unlike anything the courtroom had ever seen. When Judge Ramirez returned to the bench for sentencing, the courtroom felt different, heavier, darker, as if everyone sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. Prosecutors looked grim but steady. Defense attorneys looked anxious, knowing their final battle was moments away. Journalists tightened their grip on pens. Spectators leaned forward. And in the eye of the storm sat Jessica, small and composed, swinging her feet slightly above the floor, utterly detached from the magnitude of what was coming. Her parents couldn't stop shaking. They watched their eldest daughter with a look that blended heartbreak with bewilderment. How could they love her, fear her, and grieve because of her all at once? Judge Ramirez took a long moment before speaking. She looked at the file in front of her, then at Jessica, then at the grieving parents. The silence stretched so long that several people thought she might break down. Instead, she straightened, her voice firm, almost trembling with the weight of what she was about to deliver. This court recognizes the defendant's age, she began, but it cannot ignore the extraordinary level of planning, the absence of remorse, and the profound danger posed by her actions. Whispers rippled across the room. Prosecutors lifted their heads, defense attorneys froze, and then came the ruling that would detonate across the country. The defendant, Jessica Hermer, is hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection. Gasps broke the room apart. Someone dropped a pen, someone sobbed, someone shouted, "She's a child," before being removed by deputies. Even the prosecution, though they had argued the severity of the crime, looked stunned by the extremity of the sentence. Reporters scrambled, phones lit up. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was a national fault line cracking open under the pressure of a decision no modern judge had dared to make. Jessica, she blinked, once. Then asked in the same calm tone she always carried, when would that happen? Legal scholars later said they had never witnessed a moment so shocking, so unprecedented, so fundamentally destabilizing to public trust in the justice system. Because the question wasn't whether Jessica committed the murders, that was settled. The question was whether a nation could accept the execution of a 12-year-old. And as outrage swept across the country, the courtroom gave way to a far larger battlefield, the appeals courts, where Jessica's fate would spark one of the most controversial legal wars in American history. The moment Judge Ramirez sentenced a 12-year-old to death, the legal world erupted. Headlines exploded across every major network. Commentators argued through the night. Law professors called it the most constitutionally explosive ruling in decades. And within hours, Jessica's defense team filed an emergency appeal arguing the sentence was not just extreme, but unconstitutional at its core. The California Court of Appeal responded immediately, issuing a stay. The death sentence could not be carried out, not while deeper questions thundered beneath it. Can a child, no matter how calculated the crime, ever be subject to the ultimate punishment? That question ignited a national war of opinions. Victims' rights groups insisted the severity of the crime justified the severity of the punishment. If the act was deliberate, one advocate argued, then accountability must be equally firm. Child psychologists countered with scientific research, pointing to brain development, emotional immaturity, and the inability of children to process long-term consequences. Execution, they argued, is a punishment designed for fully formed minds. Jessica's brain wasn't even finished wiring itself. Politicians weighed in, religious leaders spoke out, talk shows buzzed. Social media burned with debates. And while the country tore itself apart over what justice should look like, Jessica watched it unfold from a special unit inside a juvenile wing, reading books, meeting with counselors, and asking guards questions about prison routines with clinical curiosity. Inside the appellate court, arguments grew sharper. The defense emphasized constitutional protections. The prosecution, though disturbed by the sentences scale, maintained that Jessica demonstrated a level of planning uncommon even in adult killers. The nation held its breath as the California Supreme Court reviewed the case. And finally, in a unanimous decision, they overturned the death sentence, declaring it unconstitutional and directing the trial court to impose a punishment that aligned with juvenile sentencing standards. But the legal war didn't end there. California's Attorney General, under immense political pressure, appealed the decision to the highest authority in the land. Suddenly, Jessica's case wasn't just a tragedy, it was on its way to the United States Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, the country realized this wasn't just about one child anymore, it was about redefining the limits of justice itself. When the United States Supreme Court agreed to hear Jessica's case, it became clear that the stakes had risen far beyond a single courtroom, a single judge, or even a single tragedy. This wasn't just the story of a 12-year-old who committed an unthinkable act. It was now a national referendum on how America defines childhood, responsibility, and the limits of punishment. Legal scholars warned that this hearing would reshape juvenile justice for a generation. Advocacy groups crowded the courthouse steps. Protesters held signs demanding accountability on one side, compassion on the other. Inside the marble halls of the Supreme Court, the 9 justices prepared to answer a question the country was battling over. Can the state ever execute someone who was a child at the time of the crime? The government's attorney argued first, insisting Jessica's case was exceptional. She described the meticulous planning, the calm execution, the cold confession. She reminded the court that this wasn't a crime of impulse, rage, or emotional instability, but strategic elimination. One justice asked sharply, "Are you suggesting age should not matter at all?" The attorney paused, then replied, "I'm suggesting this child understood what she was doing with chilling clarity." Then came Jessica's appellate lawyer, representing a child whose name had become synonymous with psychological darkness. His argument was built not on emotion, but on science. He explained how a 12-year-old brain is structurally incapable of adult-level moral reasoning, how impulse control and empathy regions are still under construction, and how the Constitution explicitly bans punishments that violate evolving standards of decency. "You may believe Jessica fully understood her actions," he said, "but the Constitution protects children even when they fail to understand themselves." As experts' research was cited and legal precedents debated, the courtroom oscillated between cold law and human tragedy. The justices listened, took notes, and pressed both sides with questions that carried the weight of history. And when the arguments ended, the nation froze, waiting for a ruling that would shape every juvenile sentencing case for decades. This was no longer about Jessica alone. This was about every child who had ever crossed the line from innocence to violence. And when the Supreme Court finally delivered its decision, the impact was so sweeping that it rewrote Jessica's future and the future of juvenile justice across America. When the Supreme Court finally released its decision, the entire nation seemed to pause. News channels cut into programming, push notifications flashed across millions of phones, and legal analysts scrambled to interpret a ruling that would shape juvenile justice for generations. In a landmark 6-3 decision, the court struck down Jessica's death sentence, declaring that executing a person for a crime committed at age 12 violated the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. But it wasn't just the outcome that stunned the country, it was the language the court used. The majority opinion stated plainly, a civilized society does not impose its harshest punishment on a mind not yet fully formed. They acknowledged the horror of Jessica's crime, the chilling calculation behind it, and the unfathomable pain inflicted on her family. But they also emphasized something equally undeniable. The brain of a 12-year-old is biologically incapable of the moral, emotional, and cognitive capacity required to justify the finality of execution. The ruling didn't excuse Jessica. It didn't soften what she had done. It drew a line, not for her sake alone, but for every child who might one day stand before a judge for an act beyond their years. Overnight, dozens of states began reviewing their juvenile sentencing laws. Advocacy groups declared the ruling a victory for science and humanity. Critics argued it stripped justice from victims. The nation split again, this time not over Jessica's guilt, but over what justice truly means when a child commits an adult-level crime. And beneath all the debates, one truth remained unchanged. Jessica would never face execution, but she would still face a lifetime shaped by the consequences of her actions. The court sent her case back to California for resentencing, forcing the system to rethink everything, from how to punish, to how to rehabilitate, to how to measure the potential for change in a mind that had once planned something so dark. For the Hermer family, the ruling delivered no comfort. Their daughters were still gone, their oldest child was still the reason why, and no legal decision, no matter how historic, could stitch those wounds closed. But what happened next raised even more questions, because as Jessica grew older behind locked doors, experts began to monitor her transformation, searching for signs of remorse or signs of something far more unsettling. After the Supreme Court ruling, Jessica was transferred to a specialized juvenile unit, a place designed for offenders too dangerous for typical youth facilities, yet too young for the adult system. It was a strange limbo, a world where childhood and criminality lived side by side, and in that controlled environment, Jessica began to grow up, not into remorse, not into reflection, but into something far more complicated. Staff members documented every detail of her development, her academic work, her therapy sessions, her interactions with other detainees. She excelled in school, racing through coursework at a pace that startled instructors. While other girls struggled with basic assignments, Jessica devoured textbooks, completed tests with precision, and asked questions that revealed a mind both hungry and detached. She treated education like strategy, not opportunity. Therapy was no different. Counselors described her as cooperative but emotionally distant, highly articulate but detached, intelligent but impenetrable. She spoke fluently about her actions, even mimicking the language therapists used, but her voice never carried remorse, only understanding. She could explain why she did what she did, but not why it was wrong. One therapist described her progress report with chilling clarity. Jessica demonstrates knowledge of empathy, not possession of it. Other girls in the unit formed friendships, created alliances, shared fears about their futures. Jessica remained separate, never aggressive, never disruptive, but always observing, watching, calculating. Years passed. She became taller, sharper, more articulate, but there was a constant truth that unsettled everyone who worked with her. She expressed sorrow only for herself, never for Nicole, never for Leslie. In her world, the crime was not a tragedy. It was a step, a choice she believed had logic, even if society condemned it. And so the question loomed over every evaluation, every session, every annual report. Was Jessica evolving into a rehabilitated adult, or was she simply becoming a more polished version of the same dangerous mind she carried at 12? And as experts debated her progress, another question began to haunt the system. Could someone who planned such darkness so young ever be trusted beyond prison walls? As Jessica approached adulthood within the structured world of juvenile confinement, a new tension began to pulse through the system, a tension far heavier than the debates about her trial or her sentence. It was the question no psychologist, no warden, no rehabilitation expert wanted to answer directly. Could someone who had planned such cold, deliberate violence at 12 ever truly be safe outside a controlled environment? Her evaluations painted a portrait that was neither hopeful nor hopeless, just deeply unsettling. On paper, she was a model inmate, no rule violations, exceptional academic performance, respectful behavior, steady participation in therapy. But beneath those checkmarks lived the part no report could soften. Therapists described her emotional growth as asymmetrical. Her intelligence soared, her communication sharpened, but her empathy remained curiously flat. She could articulate remorse, but only as a concept, not a feeling. She could analyze her actions, but from a distance, as if describing a character in a book rather than choices she had made in the woods behind her childhood home. And every time evaluators asked whether she understood the pain she caused, she spoke about consequences, not grief, about results, not human cost. This disconnect haunted professionals. Some insisted she was treatable, her young brain still moldable, still capable of transformation. Others quietly admitted that certain patterns, especially the early, calculated ones Jessica displayed, rarely softened completely. Behind closed doors, debates grew heated. How do you measure change in someone who's mastered the language of remorse but not the emotion? How do you distinguish improvement from adaptation? Was Jessica learning to feel, or simply learning how to appear safer to the people evaluating her future? Meanwhile, parole boards began preparing for the day, far in the future, but approaching nonetheless, when they would have to decide whether Jessica Hermer, now an adult, could re-enter society. And the weight of that question lingered like a storm cloud over every meeting. If she fooled us once, could she fool us again? Because rehabilitation is built on the hope that people grow. But Jessica's case forced the world to confront a darker possibility, that some minds grow sharper, not softer. And in the end, the person who understood this case better than anyone, the top lawyer who watched it unfold, revealed a final truth about courtroom confrontations that would stay with the public forever in the end. The person who understood this case more deeply than anyone wasn't a psychologist or a detective. It was the top lawyer who watched every hearing, every testimony, every silent moment where Jessica sat without a flicker of remorse. He had witnessed hardened criminals break down in tears, families reconcile in desperation, and victims' loved ones cling to hope as justice unfolded. But nothing in his decades of courtroom experience compared to the stillness of the girl at the center of this case. When he finally spoke publicly about what he had seen, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years wrestling with a truth most people would rather avoid. He said the courtroom taught him something that changed the way he viewed every case afterward. Not all confrontations inside a courtroom are battles between guilt and innocence. Some are battles between what we think a child should be and what that child actually is. He explained how people enter courtrooms expecting clear roles: victims, suspects, families, justice. But the Hermer case blurred every one of those lines. A child became the architect of destruction. A family became both sufferers and witnesses. A community learned that innocence is not guaranteed by youth. The lawyer admitted something else, something that rarely leaves the lips of a seasoned professional. The most frightening people aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones, the ones who watch, the ones who calculate, the ones who feel nothing when everyone else feels everything. That was the lesson Jessica brought into the courtroom. Not just the horror of what she had done, but the chilling reminder that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a child sitting silently at a defense table waiting. He ended his reflection with a sentence that echoed long after the cameras stopped recording. Courtrooms don't reveal who people pretend to be. They reveal who they truly are. And for those who followed the case, that truth was more haunting than the crime itself. Because the story of Jessica Hermer wasn't just about loss. It was a reminder that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, it grows quietly inside the very walls meant to keep us safe. What other cases hide truths this unsettling? Truths buried not in evidence, but in the human mind itself. Stay tuned, because some courtroom confrontations are even darker than this one.